5 real cases, 5 documented deaths, disappearances and unsolved mysteries that actually happened, stripped of movie invention and internet myth, told through what investigators, court records and journalists actually established. A frozen mountainside in the Soviet Union where 9 experienced hikers died in a way still being studied by scientists 65 years later. A quiet New Jersey suburb where an anonymous stalker terrorized a family with letters for 3 years and was never identified. A Hollywood murder from 1947 so brutal, it's still one of the most infamous unsolved killings in American history. A Long Island house where 6 people were shot dead in their beds, and the wildly different story of what supposedly happened to the family who moved in next. And the Los Angeles hotel with a body count stretching back a century, where a young woman's final days were broadcast to the entire internet and turned into a mystery even after investigators had already solved it. Here are 5 real horror stories, exactly as they actually happened. In February 1959, Soviet rescuers cut open an abandoned tent on a frozen mountainside and found something that still doesn't add up more than 60 years later. The tent had been sliced open from the inside, not the outside, by people desperate to escape something so urgent they didn't stop to find the door. Outside, footprints in the snow showed the tent's occupants had fled downhill into -30-degree cold wearing socks or a single shoe, or nothing on their feet at all. 9 people died that night, on a mountain the local Mansi people had already named Kholat Sil, which translates, depending on who you ask, to Dead Mountain. This is the real story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, one of the most thoroughly investigated unsolved deaths in modern history, and the reason nobody, not Soviet investigators in 1959 and not Russian federal prosecutors 60 years later, has ever fully agreed on what actually happened. Before getting into what actually happened on the mountain, it helps to understand who these 9 people actually were. Because it's easy, after decades of documentaries and internet forum theorizing, to lose sight of the fact that this is a story about specific, real, accomplished young people, not interchangeable horror movie victims. Igor Dyatlov, the group's 23-year-old leader, was already known within Sverdlovsk's serious hiking community as a talented radio engineering student who designed and built his own camping equipment, including a wood-burning stove the group carried specifically to survive the brutal Ural winter. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, was an experienced hiker on her 8th major expedition with the group, described by those who knew her as warm, socially confident, and one of the more experienced winter trekkers in the party. Ludmila Dubinina, 20, was a passionate, headstrong engineering student who had survived a serious hiking accident on a previous expedition, an accidental gunshot wound to the leg, and returned to serious winter hiking anyway. Semyon Zolotaryov, at 37, considerably older than the rest of the group, was a World War II veteran and ski instructor who had joined the expedition partly to complete certification requirements of his own, and whose slightly unusual profile relative to the rest of the group, an older outsider joining a tight-knit group of university friends, would later fuel entirely unsupported speculation that he was somehow connected to Soviet intelligence. These were serious, experienced outdoors people, several of them veterans of genuinely difficult prior winter expeditions, which is precisely why the nature of their deaths troubled investigators from the very beginning. This wasn't a story about inexperienced hikers making an amateur mistake in dangerous terrain. It was a story about some of the most competent winter trekkers in the region, encountering something none of their prior experience had prepared them for. The story begins in late January 1959, when a group of 10 experienced hikers and skiers set out from the city of Sverdlovsk in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union for what was meant to be a demanding but entirely routine winter expedition. Most of the group were students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, all seasoned outdoors people undertaking the trip specifically to earn Grade 3 hiking certification, the most difficult level available at the time, which required navigating extremely remote and difficult terrain in the depths of winter. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student, an experienced ski tourer after whom the pass and the entire incident would eventually be named. The plan was to travel roughly 200 miles through the northern Urals, climbing 2 mountains along the route, including Otorten, whose name in the Mansi language is sometimes translated as "Don't go there." One member of the group, Yuri Yudin, developed knee and joint pain early in the trip and turned back before the group entered the most remote stretch of the route, a decision that almost certainly saved his life and one he reportedly carried guilt over for the rest of his own life afterward. The remaining 9, 7 men and 2 women, continued on, expected to send a telegram once they reached the town of Vizay on their way back, sometime around February 12th. That telegram never came. When more than a week passed with no word, and Dyatlov's family and the hiking club grew increasingly alarmed, a search and rescue effort was finally launched in late February, involving volunteers, police, army units, and eventually the Soviet Air Force. On February 26th, searchers found the group's tent still standing on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. What they found inside and around it immediately signaled that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The tent had been cut open from inside in multiple places using a knife rather than unzipped or exited through the entrance. Nearly all the hikers' belongings, including their boots, warm outer clothing and food, were still inside. A trail of footprints, most barefoot or in socks, some with only a single shoe, led away from the tent down the slope toward a tree line roughly a mile away, footprints that gradually became harder to follow as the search moved further from the campsite. Over the following weeks, the bodies were located one by one, and the picture that emerged only grew stranger. The first 2 bodies, discovered near the tree line beneath a large cedar tree, were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, found wearing only their underwear despite the extreme cold, with evidence at the base of the cedar suggesting one or both had climbed it, breaking branches roughly 17 feet up, seemingly trying to see something or escape something back toward the tent. Between the cedar and the tent, searchers found the bodies of Dyatlov himself, along with Zinanida Komogorova and Rustam Slobodin, apparently having died at different points while attempting to climb back up the slope toward the tent, as though the immediate danger, whatever it was, had passed, and they were trying to return for warmth and supplies before succumbing to the cold. Slobodin's autopsy would later reveal a skull fracture consistent with a significant blow to the head, though not immediately fatal on its own. The remaining 4 bodies weren't found until May, when the snow finally began to melt, buried under 12 feet of snow in a ravine further down the slope. And it's these 4 autopsies that turned an already unsettling story into a genuine, decades-long mystery. 3 of the 4, Ludmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Sibiobrig-Knowles, had sustained injuries so severe that the lead medical examiner compared the force involved to that of a car crash. Sibiobrig-Knowles had a major skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotaryov both had multiple broken ribs, and in Dubinina's case, catastrophic chest trauma, consistent with extremely high-force blunt impact. Injuries the examining pathologist stated could not have been caused by another person, since there was no way for a human being to generate that kind of force by hand, and no obvious external wounds like those a blunt weapon would typically leave. Stranger still, Dubinina was missing her tongue, along with her eyes, part of her lips, and a fragment of skull bone. Injuries some investigators initially attributed to decomposition and predation by small animals or the effects of the ravine's meltwater stream over the following months, while others found that explanation unsatisfying. Some of the group's clothing, when later tested, was found to carry elevated levels of radioactive contamination, a detail that only deepened the case's mystery and fed decades of speculation. Though experts have since pointed out this was most likely linked to Zolotaryov and Krivonishenko's known prior work or exposure in Soviet facilities connected to the nuclear industry, rather than anything that happened on the mountain itself. The original Soviet investigation in 1959 closed the case relatively quickly, officially attributing the deaths to an unspecified, compelling natural force, a deliberately vague classification that has fueled speculation for generations, in no small part because it reads like the state, either, didn't know what killed 9 of its own citizens or knew and wasn't saying. In the decades since, in the absence of a fully satisfying official explanation, the Dyatlov Pass incident has attracted one of the most extensive folk theory ecosystems attached to any unsolved death in modern history. Some pointed to the region's proximity to Soviet military testing and speculated about secret weapons tests, orbital rocket debris, or classified defense activity the government would have had every incentive to cover up. Others leaned into the genuinely strange forensic details. The extreme, seemingly targeted injuries with no external wounds, the missing tongue and eyes, and proposed a struggle with some other party entirely, possibly the local Mansi people, a theory investigators dismissed early on after finding no evidence of any footprints beyond the hiker's own, and no signs of a struggle involving another human presence near the tent. Paranormal and cryptid theories flourished too, everything from Yeti attacks to unexplained lights reported by other hiking groups in the same region around the same dates. Lights that some witnesses at the time genuinely did report seeing in the night sky, though no conclusive source for them was ever established. The scientific explanation that has gained the most traction in recent years centers on a phenomenon called a slab avalanche, and it took decades and considerably more sophisticated modeling than existed in 1959 to make that case convincingly. In 2019, Russian federal prosecutors reopened an investigation into the case, partly in response to renewed public and media pressure, and partly using investigative and forensic tools that simply hadn't existed 6 decades earlier. The reopened inquiry, led by prosecutor Andrei Koyakov, ultimately concluded that a slab avalanche was the most probable cause, a specific and somewhat unusual type of avalanche, where a cohesive block, or slab, of wind-packed snow breaks away from a weaker underlying layer and slides downhill, largely intact rather than the more commonly imagined cascading, powdery avalanche most people picture. A team of researchers, including specialists from Switzerland, went further in a peer-reviewed 2021 study published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment, using engineering models originally developed for the automotive industry, adapted specifically to simulate snow slab mechanics to test whether a delayed slab avalanche, triggered hours after the hikers cut into the slope to pitch their tent, weakening the snowpack, could plausibly account for both the tent damage and the severity of the injuries found on Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignoles. Their modeling suggested it could. A slab of snow, even a relatively modest one given the specific slope angle and snow conditions that likely existed that night, striking sleeping bodies inside a tent could generate exactly the kind of blunt force trauma the autopsies described, without needing to bury the tent completely or leave. The more obvious visual signature of a large-scale avalanche, which is part of why searchers arriving weeks later found no obvious avalanche debris at the site. That still leaves the harder question of why 9 experienced, capable outdoors people in the middle of a Ural winter would cut their way out of their only shelter and flee downhill into extreme cold, some of them barely dressed, rather than staying inside a compromised but still standing tent to recover whatever gear they could. The most widely accepted explanation folds directly into the slab avalanche theory itself. If the hikers genuinely believed in the terrifying, disorienting first moments after a slab of snow struck their tent, that a second, larger avalanche was imminent, cutting their way out immediately and moving away from the slope, rather than pausing to dress properly or search for boots in a partially collapsed, snow-filled tent in pitch darkness, would represent a rational, if ultimately fatal, survival decision made under extreme panic and cold-induced, impaired judgment. Investigators point to a genuinely tragic detail supporting this reading. The group did eventually try to build a small shelter and fire near the tree line, and several of them clearly attempted to climb back up toward the tent afterward, once the immediate danger appeared to have passed, only to succumb to hypothermia and their injuries along the way. some managing to get remarkably close to safety before they died. It's also worth acknowledging that the slab avalanche theory isn't the only serious, scientifically grounded explanation researchers have proposed over the years, even setting aside the more tabloid-friendly cryptid and cover-up theories entirely. One respected alternative, put forward by Soviet investigator Yevgeny Buyanov years before the 2019 reopening, centers on katabatic winds, extremely powerful, localized downslope winds that can develop under specific terrain and weather conditions, strong enough in the most severe cases to physically damage or collapse a tent and force occupants into a genuine survival emergency, without any snow slab being involved at all. Buyanov's version of events proposed that ferocious winds, combined with disorientation, darkness, and worsening frostbite, could account for the full sequence of the hikers' decisions and deaths, without requiring an avalanche at all. Another line of investigation, considerably more speculative but taken seriously enough to be formally studied, examined the possibility of infrasound, extremely low-frequency sound waves generated by wind moving across the specific rounded shape of Kholat Cycle's summit, a phenomenon known to occur at certain mountain formations elsewhere in the world, and documented in some cases to produce genuine physiological effects in humans nearby, including nausea, disorientation, and overwhelming, irrational panic, even though the sound itself sits below the threshold of normal human hearing. No physical evidence has ever definitively confirmed the infrasound theory applied to this specific night on this specific mountain, and it remains, by the admission of the researchers who studied it most seriously, a plausible contributing factor at best, rather than a proven standalone cause. What all of these more scientifically grounded theories share, whether it's the slab avalanche conclusion the 2019 investigation ultimately favored, Buyanov's katabatic wind model, or the infrasound hypothesis, is a common through line, something forced 9 highly capable, experienced people to make. An emergency decision, cutting their way out of their only shelter in the middle of the night in extreme cold, that they would never have made under any less desperate circumstance. And every serious researcher who has spent real time with the case file agrees that whatever specifically triggered that decision, it happened extremely fast, gave the group almost no time to dress or gather supplies, and was severe enough that fleeing into instant, obvious mortal danger outside still seemed like the safer option compared to staying inside. Not everyone finds the slab avalanche explanation fully satisfying, and it's worth being honest about that rather than presenting it as a tidy, universally accepted final answer. Critics of the theory point out that the slope where the tent was pitched has a gradient some experts consider too shallow for a classic avalanche to build meaningful momentum, that no member of the original 1959 search team reported any visible avalanche debris despite searching the area extensively within weeks of the deaths, and that Dyatlov himself, an experienced winter hiker, would presumably have recognized basic avalanche risk terrain and avoided pitching a tent directly on a slope where that risk was significant. Defenders of the slab theory respond that a delayed slab release, hours after the tent was pitched and the snowpack had been mechanically weakened by the act of cutting into it, is a genuinely different and considerably harder to visually detect phenomenon than the large-scale avalanches most people, including 1959-era Soviet search teams without modern snow science training, would have known to look for, and that even a relatively small, localized slab released directly onto sleeping bodies inside a confined tent space could produce injuries this severe without leaving dramatic surface evidence behind. What almost everyone studying the case, on every side of the avalanche debate, does agree on is this: the more exotic theories, military testing, cryptid attacks, and paranormal explanations that dominated decades of tabloid coverage and documentary specials have never been supported by any physical evidence recovered from the site, while the mundane, thoroughly documented realities of extreme cold, panic, and genuinely severe winter terrain have consistently proven sufficient to explain nearly every individual detail of what happened that night. However disturbing those details remain, taken together, the Dyatlov Pass incident endures not because the explanation has to be supernatural or covered up, but because 9 real, specific, named young people on a hiking trip that thousands of other groups completed safely in that same region across that same era encountered one specific combination of terrain, weather, and decision-making that turned a routine winter expedition into one of the most examined tragedies in the history of Soviet mountaineering. 65 years on, still capable of generating new, peer-reviewed research trying to fully explain exactly what went wrong on that mountainside in the dark. It's worth spending a moment on why the Soviet state's own secrecy did so much to fuel the case's mystique, because that context matters as much as any single forensic detail. The 1959 investigation file was classified for decades after the deaths, only becoming available to independent researchers in the post-Soviet era, and that classification alone, in a country where government secrecy around military and nuclear activity was a well-founded, constant public assumption, was more than enough to convince a skeptical public that something was being covered up, regardless of what the actual explanation turned out to be. The Ural region genuinely was home to sensitive Soviet military and nuclear infrastructure at the time, including facilities connected to the country's early nuclear weapons program, not far from where the hikers died, which is precisely why the radioactive contamination found on some of the victims' clothing took on such outsized significance in public speculation for years afterward, even though later analysis traced it credibly back to Zolotaryov and Krivonishenko's own documented prior work history, rather than anything that occurred during the hike itself. When a government habitually classifies information by default, the public reasonably assumes classification always means something is being hidden, and in the Dyatlov case specifically, that assumption arguably did more to keep the mystery alive across 60 years than any individual piece of forensic evidence did. The case's staying power in global popular culture is itself worth examining, because the Dyatlov Pass incident has become something close to a permanent fixture of internet mystery culture, spawning multiple feature films, numerous documentary series, dedicated research forums where amateur investigators continue to pore over the original case file page by page, and a cottage industry of true crime and paranormal content built almost entirely around the case's most visually and narratively compelling details. The slashed tent, the barefoot footprints, the missing tongue. That level of sustained public fascination has occasionally worked against clearer public understanding of the case rather than for it, since dramatic retellings understandably tend to foreground the strangest individual facts, the radioactivity, the injuries compared to car crash trauma, the missing eyes and tongue, while spending considerably less time on the more mundane, harder to dramatize scientific work, engineering-grade avalanche modeling, forensic pathology comparing injury patterns to known blunt force trauma cases, that has actually done the most to narrow down what plausibly happened. It's a pattern worth recognizing in true crime and mystery media more broadly. The details that make a story most shareable are rarely the same details that do the most explanatory work, and the Dyatlov Pass incident is possibly the clearest example of that gap in the entire genre. There's also real, documented human aftermath worth including, because the 9 deaths on Kholat Syakh didn't happen in isolation from the community around them. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of the original group who turned back early due to knee pain, lived until 2013, and by his own repeated public accounts carried genuine survivor's guilt for the rest of his life, attending memorial events for his former hiking companions for decades and cooperating extensively with later researchers and journalists trying to piece together the group's final days from his own first-hand knowledge of their planning and preparation. The families of the 9 victims fought for years, largely unsuccessfully, to get Soviet and later Russian authorities to release additional case file details and to formally revisit the original compelling natural force ruling, a campaign that helped directly motivate the 2019 reopening of the investigation 6 decades after the deaths. Some relatives of the victims have publicly stated that even the 2019 slab avalanche conclusion, however scientifically rigorous the underlying modeling, doesn't fully satisfy their own decades of questions, less because they dispute the physics and more because a scientific explanation for the Mechanism of death still doesn't fully answer the deeper, more personal question every family in a case like this eventually asks. Given how experienced and careful their children and siblings were, why that slope? Why that night? And why, out of every hiking group traveling through the Urals across that entire winter season, was it specifically the 9 of them? The physical site itself has, in the decades since, become something between a memorial and a genuine, if remote, pilgrimage destination. A monument to the 9 hikers was erected in Yekaterinburg, formerly Sverdlovsk, the city they set out from, and smaller memorial markers exist closer to the pass itself, though reaching Kholat cycle remains a serious undertaking, requiring specialized winter equipment and considerable backcountry experience, largely restricting visits to dedicated hikers, researchers, and documentary crews rather than casual tourists. Russian outdoor clubs and university hiking associations, including groups directly affiliated with the modern successor to the Ural Polytechnic Institute, have continued running memorial expeditions to the area on significant anniversaries of the deaths, treating the site less as a horror tourism curiosity and more as a genuine act of remembrance for 9 specific young people who died on a trip that, for thousands of other winter hikers before and since, has been completed without incident. That distinction between the site as a place of real, ongoing grief for a specific community and the site as a subject of endless online mystery content produced by people with no connection to the victims at all, is one worth holding on to, since it's easy, especially watching yet another documentary retelling built around the case's strangest individual details, to lose sight of the fact that Kholat Syakhl is, first and foremost, still exactly what the Mansi people who named it centuries earlier warned it might be: a genuinely dangerous, unforgiving stretch of mountain terrain, where 9 real people from Sverdlovsk once set out for a difficult, ambitious winter hike and never made it home. In June 2014, Derek and Maria Broadus bought their dream home, a 6-bedroom Dutch colonial house at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey, for $1.3 million, planning renovations before moving their 3 young children in that summer. Within days of closing, a typed letter arrived addressed simply to the new owner. It welcomed them to the neighborhood, and then it got considerably worse. The letter writer claimed to have watched the house for decades, referred to the Broadus children by physical description despite the family not yet living there, and signed off as the Watcher. Over the following weeks, more letters arrived, each one more specific and more unsettling than the last. More than a decade later, nobody has ever been definitively identified as the author. No criminal charges have ever been filed, and the case remains, officially, completely unsolved. This is the real story of the Watcher of Westfield, one of the most documented and most genuinely unresolved stalking cases in recent American history. The first letter arrived within days of the closing, before the Broaduses had moved a single box into the house, which was itself deeply unsettling, since it suggested the writer either had inside knowledge of the sale or was actively monitoring the property closely enough to know the moment new ownership changed hands. The letter asked why the previous owners, the Woods family, who had lived at 657 Boulevard for roughly 2 decades, were leaving, and stated the house had been the subject of the writers, or in some versions of the letters, an entire family's attention for a very long time, describing 657 Boulevard as having been on my watch for the last 2 decades. It referenced the Broadus family by name and made pointed comments about the young children who would soon be living there, describing them in enough physical detail, ages and general appearance that the Broaduses could no longer treat it as a random prank targeting any new homeowner in town. It closed by asking, "Do you need to fill the house with young blood?" A line that, more than any other single detail in the entire case, is responsible for how thoroughly this story spread once it eventually became public. A second letter followed roughly 2 weeks later, after the family had begun visible renovation work on the property, and it escalated considerably. It criticized the specific changes the family was making to the house, indicating the writer wasn't simply watching from a distance, but observing renovation activity closely enough to comment on it in real time. It referenced sacrifices the writer claimed prior owners had made to keep the house safe, without ever clarifying what those sacrifices actually were, and issued an explicit demand that the family bring the writer young blood, repeating and escalating the disturbing language from the first letter rather than walking it back. A third letter arrived not long after, addressed even more specifically to the family's children by name, describing them individually and asking pointed rhetorical questions about which child's bedroom faced the street, details that suggested the writer either had genuine surveillance access to the house's interior layout or had obtained that information through some other means the family couldn't identify. By this point, understandably terrified, the Broaduses had already contacted the Westfield Police Department and installed security cameras around the property, but with no suspect, no forensic leads from the letters themselves, and young children who were now too frightened to move into the home. Their parents had already spent well over $1 million purchasing. The family made the extraordinary decision to delay moving in entirely while the investigation continued. The police investigation that followed was, by any measure, extensive. Officers interviewed dozens of neighbors up and down the street, examined the letters for fingerprints and DNA, and eventually brought in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to help build a profile of the likely author. Handwriting and forensic document analysts studied the typed letters closely for any identifying quirks, while investigators pursued numerous individual persons of interest over the following years, including at various points several immediate neighbors on Boulevard itself, without ever developing sufficient evidence to formally charge anyone. In a genuinely striking development that added an entirely new, almost gothic layer to the case, one of the letters made a specific, cryptic reference that led investigators, along with independent researchers and true crime enthusiasts following the case once it became public, to re-examine the house's own history, uncovering a real, previously obscure detail, a rumor, never conclusively proven, that a skeleton had once been found, bricked up inside a chimney at the house decades earlier. A detail some later letters seem to obliquely reference, though investigators were never able to substantiate whether that specific rumor had any basis in fact, or whether the letter writer was simply drawing on local folklore that predated their own involvement in the case entirely. It's worth pausing on just how disruptive this became to the family's daily life long before any lawsuit or media coverage entered the picture. The Broaduses initially tried to keep the letters private, worried that publicity would only draw more unwanted attention to the house and their children. So for the first stretch of the ordeal, they were essentially fighting an anonymous, escalating threat almost entirely alone, coordinating privately with Westfield Police while still maintaining their old rental home so the kids had somewhere stable to sleep. Derek Broadus later described spending nights parked outside 657 Boulevard in his car, watching the house himself, hoping to catch some sign of who was leaving notes in their mailbox or slipping them through the mail slot. Maria Broadus has spoken publicly about the strain the situation placed on the whole family, describing a persistent, low-grade fear that followed her children even at their temporary home, since if the letter writer really did have the kind of close, ongoing surveillance capability the letters implied, there was no way to be fully certain the family was safe anywhere in town, not just at the house they hadn't yet moved into. That psychological toll, as much as the financial loss the family eventually took on the sale, is a significant part of why the case has resonated so strongly with people who followed it since it captures a specific, modern kind of dread. The fear of being watched by someone with no name, no face, and, as it turned out, no discoverable identity at all. There's also a legal dimension to the case worth understanding, because it partly explains why, even if investigators had identified a strong suspect, prosecution might still have been difficult. New Jersey's harassment and stalking statutes, like most states' equivalent laws, genuinely require prosecutors to prove a credible, specific pattern of conduct intended to cause fear alongside a confirmed identity behind that conduct, and letters alone, however disturbing their content can be, legally ambiguous. without a clear, provable link to a specific author, particularly if that author never followed through on any of the threatening language with an actual physical act. Legal analysts who examined the case at the time noted that even a strongly suspected author, absent DNA, a handwriting match, a confession, or some other hard forensic link, would have been extremely difficult to actually convict under existing stalking and harassment law, which is part of why the investigation's core challenge was never really a lack of police effort. Years of resources genuinely were devoted to the case, so much as the fundamental difficulty of building a prosecutable case around anonymous typed letters with no fingerprints, no matching DNA, and, ultimately, no confirmed author at all. Unable to move into a home their own children were now afraid of, and increasingly convinced the harassment might come from someone with intimate knowledge of the house, possibly even a previous owner or someone connected to that family, the Broaduses took the unusual step in June 2015 of filing a civil lawsuit against John and Andrea Woods, the family who had sold them the house. The suit alleged the Woods family had themselves received at least one letter from the watcher shortly before the sale closed, and had failed to disclose that fact to the Broaduses. A serious allegation, given that such a disclosure, under real estate law, could reasonably be expected to affect a buyer's decision to purchase a property at all. The Woods family denied any wrongdoing and filed counterclaims of their own, alleging defamation. The resulting litigation dragged on for more than 2 years, generating extensive court filings that would later become a primary source for journalists and researchers piecing together the timeline of the case before New Jersey Superior Court Judge Camille M. Mill. Kenny ultimately dismissed both the Broaduses' claims and the Woods family's countersuit in October 2017, finding insufficient legal basis to hold either side liable without ever resolving who had actually written the letters in the first place. Unable to safely occupy the house, unable to comfortably sell it either without the burden of disclosing the harassment to any prospective buyer, and by this point having spent years and enormous legal fees fighting a legal battle that ultimately answered none of their original questions, the Broaduses eventually listed 657 Boulevard for sale at a significant loss. It took considerable time to find a buyer willing to take on a house with this level of public notoriety attached to it. The property finally sold in July 2019 for $959,360, roughly $340,000 less than the Broaduses had originally paid for it 5 years earlier, an enormous financial loss layered on top of years of psychological strain. For a family that, by every available account, had done nothing more than purchase a house in an ordinary, affluent New Jersey suburb. Over the years the case has been open. Several real individuals were named publicly, at different points, as persons of interest, and it's worth being precise about their status, since none of them was ever charged, and each was ultimately either cleared or simply never connected to the letters with enough evidence to proceed. Derek Broadus reportedly grew suspicious early on of a next-door neighbor, an older man named Michael Langford, who didn't appear to work and had a direct sightline onto the family's enclosed porch from his own property. When investigators later recovered a trace of female DNA from one of the letters, Langford's household came under fresh scrutiny. But his sister's DNA was tested and did not match, and no charges ever followed. Journalists covering the case also surfaced a considerably more offbeat theory involving a local high school English teacher named Robert Kaplow, whose name circulated among researchers digging through the case for stylistic or biographical connections to the letter's unusual, almost theatrical prose style, though this too never developed into anything resembling formal charges or confirmed evidence. Investigators additionally brought in a forensic linguist at one stage, specifically to analyze word choice, sentence rhythm, and phrasing across all the letters, looking for anything that might narrow down the writer's age, education level, or regional background, an approach that generated useful, investigative leads without ever producing a definitive identification either. A separate, considerably more cynical theory has circulated for years too, essentially arguing there was never any outside stalker at all, and that the entire ordeal was either fabricated or significantly exaggerated by the Broaddus family themselves. Whether for insurance purposes, to escape a real estate purchase they developed cold feet about, or simply for the media attention and eventual book and television deals that did, in fact, follow. It's a theory that's been raised publicly by internet skeptics and message board investigators repeatedly enough that most serious journalistic coverage of the case addresses it directly. And it's worth noting what actually argues against it: independent police and prosecutor investigations, conducted by parties with no financial stake in the story either way, treated the letters and the threat they posed as credible enough to dedicate years of resources to the case. The Woods family's own separate legal filings referenced having received at least one similar letter before selling the house, corroborating the pattern independent of anything the Broadduses said. And the financial reality is that the family sold the house at a loss of roughly $340,000 rather than profiting from the ordeal in any straightforward way. None of that proves the more elaborate hoax theory false beyond all doubt, but it's a considerably harder case to make than casual online speculation sometimes suggests. The case reached a genuinely enormous new audience in 2018, when investigative journalist Reeves Wiedemann published a detailed feature on the Broaddus' ordeal in New York Magazine, drawing directly on the extensive court filings, police records, and interviews with the family that had accumulated over the preceding 4 years, and effectively introducing the case to a national audience for the first time. That article, and the wave of subsequent podcast episodes, true crime video essays, and long-form journalism it inspired, eventually led to a dramatized Netflix limited series in 2022, loosely based on the case, which brought the watcher to an even larger global audience, though the series took considerable creative liberties with the underlying facts, inventing suspects, storylines, and resolutions that have no basis in the actual, still entirely unsolved case. A distinction worth being clear about, given how frequently fictionalized details from the show have since been repeated online as though they were established fact about the real Westfield case. Once the New York Magazine story broke in 2008, 657 Boulevard effectively stopped being just a house and became a genuine local landmark, for entirely the wrong reasons. Westfield residents reported a steady trickle of strangers slowing down or stopping outside the property specifically to look at, and in some cases photograph, the now famous Watcher House, years after the Broadduses themselves had already moved out. Local news outlets covered the traffic and gawking as its own minor nuisance story, separate from the original case, a strange coda in which a private family's ordeal became a kind of unofficial tourist stop for true crime and internet mystery enthusiasts, long after any of the family who'd actually lived through it were still connected to the property at all. The Netflix adaptation in 2022, developed by Ryan Murphy and starring Naomi Watts and Bobby Cannavale as fictionalized versions of the Broadduses, drew record streaming numbers in its opening weeks and introduced the case to a global audience far larger than the original magazine article ever reached. But it's worth being direct about how much creative invention the show layered on top of the true story specifically for dramatic effect. The series invents an entire cast of eccentric named suspects: a mysterious historical murderer who supposedly once lived in the house, a secretive local preservation society with its own conspiratorial agenda, and a considerably more theatrical, tidy sense of forward momentum than the real investigation ever had, none of which has any basis in the actual Union County police file. Real journalists who covered the case, along with Derek and Maria Broaddus themselves in subsequent interviews, have been fairly candid that the show functions as a loose dramatization inspired by their ordeal, rather than any kind of accurate reconstruction of it, and that the real case's most disturbing quality, the total absence of a resolution, an arrest, or even a strong, confirmed suspect, doesn't translate especially well into a satisfying scripted television ending, which is a large part of why the show invents one instead. In 2018, in a renewed push to develop new leads, the Union County Prosecutor's Office asked residents living near 657 Boulevard to voluntarily submit DNA samples for comparison against genetic material recovered from the letters, an approach that had proven successful in cracking other long cold cases elsewhere in the country around the same period. most famously the Golden State Killer investigation just months earlier. None of the voluntary samples collected in Westfield ultimately matched. Investigators have, at various points over the years, named and cleared several individual persons of interest, including specific former neighbors whose names circulated publicly at different stages of the case, without ever formally charging any of them, and without the Westfield Police Department or Union County prosecutors ever publicly closing the investigation or declaring it fully resolved. What makes the Watcher case so genuinely unsettling, more than a decade on, isn't any single detail so much as the complete absence of a satisfying ending. There was no dramatic arrest, no courtroom confession, no definitive DNA match connecting the letters to a specific named individual. The family at the center of the story, an ordinary couple who simply wanted to renovate a house and raise their children in a quiet suburban town, spent 5 years and a substantial fortune fighting an opponent who was never identified, never charged, and never stopped, as far as public record shows, of their own accord, rather than because anyone was ever caught. The letters themselves stopped arriving sometime after the Broaduses moved out and the house changed hands again, which some have taken as evidence the writer was specifically fixated on the Broadus family rather than the house itself, while others have pointed out it's equally consistent with a writer fixated on the house, who simply lost interest once its unwanted new notoriety made further letters pointless. Either reading remains entirely speculative. The current owners of 65T7 Boulevard, who purchased the property in 2019, fully aware of its history, have not publicly reported receiving any letters from the Watcher since taking ownership. And as of the most recent public reporting on the case, the identity of the person or persons who spent years terrorizing an innocent family over a house they'd simply bought to live in remains, exactly as it did on the day the first letter arrived, completely and entirely unknown. What ultimately separates the Watcher case from most other unsolved mysteries in this genre is how ordinary its setting was, and how mundane the initial trigger appears to have been. This wasn't a remote wilderness or an abandoned building with decades of dark history behind it. It was a well-maintained 6-bedroom family home on a quiet, tree-lined street in a wealthy, thoroughly ordinary New Jersey commuter suburb, the kind of neighborhood most people would consider about as safe and unremarkable as American suburban life gets. Whoever wrote those letters didn't need a decaying mansion or an isolated location to generate genuine, sustained terror. They needed nothing more than a working knowledge of one specific family's schedule, an intimate familiarity with the layout and history of one specific house, and a willingness to keep writing, months and then years after any rational person might have expected the joke, or grudge, or fixation, whatever it actually was, to run its course. Investigators who worked the case have noted, in various interviews given after the file effectively went cold, that the sheer persistence of the letters, arriving steadily over roughly 3 years rather than as a single cruel prank, remains one of the most genuinely unusual features of the entire case relative to more typical harassment or stalking investigations, where the behavior in question tends to escalate quickly towards some kind of resolution, an arrest, a confrontation, or simply the harasser losing interest, rather than sustaining itself patiently for years with no apparent end goal ever being pursued. More than a decade after that first letter landed in the Broaduses' mailbox, the case sits in an unusual limbo that distinguishes it from most cold cases covered in true crime media. It isn't formally closed. Union County investigators have never announced they've exhausted every lead or that the file has been shelved permanently, which means, at least in theory, a DNA match, a confession, or some new piece of forensic technology not yet available in 2014 could still crack the case open at some point in the future. The same way genetic genealogy databases eventually cracked decades-old cold cases that once looked just as permanently unsolved as this one still does. Until that happens, though, the Watcher of Westfield remains exactly what it's been since the summer of 2014. A case built entirely on paper and dread rather than physical violence, with a family who did nothing more than buy a house now permanently associated with one of the strangest, most sustained anonymous harassment campaigns in recent American memory, and a writer who, whoever they are, got exactly what the letters always seemed most interested in achieving: being watched right back by an entire country, forever, without ever once having to reveal their face. One lasting practical legacy of the case, separate from its true crime notoriety, has played out quietly in New Jersey real estate law and practice in the years since. The Broadus family's core legal argument that the prior owners should have been legally obligated to disclose the watcher letters before selling the property exposed a genuine, previously under-examined gap in how seller disclosure requirements work in most states. Since psychological stigma, or non-physical harassment history tied to a property typically falls into a legal grey area, very different from the more clear-cut structural or environmental defects standard disclosure forms are built to cover, real estate attorneys and industry publications covering the case in the years since have pointed to it repeatedly as a cautionary example in discussions of so-called stigmatized property law, and some agents and legal commentators have specifically cited the Westfield case when advising sellers on the safer, more conservative approach to disclosing unusual property history, even when a given state's law doesn't strictly require it, precisely because the Woods family's decision not to disclose, whatever their legal justification at the time, became the single most litigated and most publicly scrutinized decision in the entire case. Whether any specific state law has actually changed as a direct result remains modest and state by state rather than sweeping. But the case is now a genuinely standard reference point in real estate law discussions of disclosure obligations around non-physical property stigma, a fairly unusual legacy for a case that otherwise never produced a single arrest, charge, or definitively identified suspect. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a mother walking with her young daughter down a quiet residential street in Los Angeles spotted something in the weeds of a vacant lot that she initially mistook for a discarded department store mannequin. It wasn't a mannequin. It was the body of a 22-year-old woman named Elizabeth Short, and what had been done to her was so extreme, so deliberately staged, that even hardened Los Angeles homicide detectives, who had seen plenty by 1947, described it as one of the worst crime scenes of their careers. Nearly 80 years later, despite one of the largest police investigations in American history, over 60 false confessions, and a level of enduring public fascination matched by almost no other unsolved murder in the country, nobody has ever been charged with killing Elizabeth Short. This is the real story of the Black Dahlia, separating what's actually documented fact from the decades of myth, tabloid invention, and competing theories that have grown up around one of the most notorious unsolved murders in American history. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, one of 5 daughters in a working-class family whose early life was shaped by hardship well before she ever set foot in Los Angeles. Her father, Cleo Short, disappeared when Elizabeth was still a child, abandoning the family after his car was found empty on a bridge, an apparent suicide staging that turned out, years later, to be exactly that, a staged disappearance when he resurfaced alive in California and eventually reconnected with his daughter as a young adult. Elizabeth struggled with severe bronchitis and asthma as a child, spending time in hospitals and reportedly undergoing lung surgery. Health problems that periodically sent her to warmer climates for recovery even before she moved west permanently as a young woman. Like many young women of her generation drawn to Southern California by the glamour of the film industry, Short arrived in Los Angeles hoping, in some vague, widely shared way, for a shot at the movies, though there's no solid evidence she ever had any serious industry connections, formal acting, training, or meaningful career prospects in that direction. What she did have, by every account of people who knew her, was a striking, memorable appearance, dark hair, pale skin, and a habit of wearing black clothing that, combined with a play on the title of a contemporary film noir called The Blue Dahlia, is where the nickname Black Dahlia originated, a Bible name the press invented after her death rather than one she used or was known by while alive. In the months before her death, Short lived an unsettled, transient existence typical of many young women trying to make it in post-war Los Angeles without steady income or a permanent address, moving between rented rooms, motels, and the homes of various friends and acquaintances across the city. She was reportedly last seen alive on January 9, 1947, at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where witnesses recalled her being dropped off by a man after an earlier meeting, and where she was seen making a phone call before apparently walking off alone into the evening. What happened to her over the following 6 days before her body was discovered on the 15th has never been definitively established, representing one of the case's most fundamental, enduring gaps. Investigators have never conclusively placed her at any specific location during that window, meaning the actual murder scene, as opposed to the location where her body was ultimately left, has never been identified. The crime scene itself, in the 600 block of South Norton Avenue in the Lymert Park neighborhood, was almost incomprehensibly brutal, and it's worth describing what was actually documented, since decades of sensationalized retelling have sometimes distorted even the confirmed facts. Short's body had been cut cleanly in half at the waist. A separation forensic examiners determined had been carried out with considerable surgical precision, fueling early theories that whoever committed the murder had some degree of medical or anatomical training, though this remains debated among later researchers who've argued the separation, while precise, didn't necessarily require formal surgical skill to achieve. Her body had been drained of blood and thoroughly washed before being placed in the lot, meaning, definitively, that she had not been killed at the location where she was found and had instead been murdered and mutilated somewhere else entirely, before being deliberately transported and posed in the vacant lot. Her face bore deep lacerations extending from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, injuries popularly described in later years as a Glasgow smile, creating a grotesque, exaggerated grin. She had been extensively bound and tortured prior to death, based on rope marks and other injuries documented at autopsy, and portions of tissue had been removed from her body, along with evidence of post-mortem mutilation. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office documented in clinical detail in the original autopsy report, though several of the era's newspapers published considerably more sensationalized, and in some cases simply inaccurate, versions of those findings at the time. Details that have unfortunately persisted in some retellings of the case ever since. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation, in the weeks and months that followed, quickly became one of the largest manhunts in the department's history to that point, ultimately drawing in the LAPD, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and eventually agencies well beyond California. Following leads that came in from across the country, officers and detectives conducted literally hundreds of interviews, tracking down virtually everyone known to have crossed paths with Short. In her final months, former roommates, acquaintances from various bars and restaurants she'd frequented, men she'd dated or been seen with, and family members. The case became a genuine media sensation almost immediately, with Los Angeles newspapers competing aggressively for scoops in a way that, by modern investigative standards, actively compromised the case. Reporters sometimes reaching potential witnesses or even evidence before police did, and the intense, sustained tabloid coverage of the murder's most gruesome details is largely responsible for why the case attracted such an unusual volume of false confessions. More than 60 individuals over the following decades claimed to have killed Elizabeth Short, almost all of them quickly ruled out by investigators once basic facts of their accounts failed to match details that had never actually been made public. A classic pattern seen in high-profile murder cases that receive this level of sustained media attention. Despite the scale of the investigation, no one was ever formally charged, and the reasons why offer a genuine window into the state of forensic science and interagency cooperation in late 1940s American law enforcement. DNA analysis, now a cornerstone of modern homicide investigation, didn't exist as a forensic tool at all in 1947, meaning any biological evidence recovered from the scene or from Short's body, however carefully preserved at the time, could never be directly matched to a suspect using methods that would be standard in any comparable case today. Competition and territorial friction between the LAPD, the Sheriff's Department, and other involved agencies reportedly hampered evidence sharing and coordinated follow-up at multiple points during the investigation. And the sheer volume of public tips, false leads, and confessions that poured in during the case's peak media frenzy consumed enormous investigative resources chasing dead ends. Resources that, with the benefit of hindsight, likely could have been better directed toward a smaller number of more credible leads. One of the case's strangest developments came just over a week after the body was discovered, and it's one of the few pieces of the investigation that reads almost exactly as unsettling in the original documented record as it does in decades of retelling. On January 24th, a postal worker flagged a suspicious manila envelope addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner, one of the city's major newspapers, which had been aggressively competing for exclusive details on the case since the murder made headlines. Inside were several of Elizabeth Short's actual personal belongings: her birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, and an address book missing several pages, along with a message assembled entirely from individual letters and words cut out of newspapers and magazines, reading, "Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers. Here is Dahlia's belongings." Every item in the envelope, along with the envelope itself, had been deliberately doused in gasoline before mailing, a method investigators immediately recognized as a calculated attempt to destroy any fingerprints, hair, or other trace evidence the sender might otherwise have left behind, evidence of real forensic awareness on the part of whoever sent it. 2 days later, on January 26th, the Examiner received a second communication, this one handwritten, reading, "Here it is. Turning in wed, Jan, 29:10 a.m. Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia Avenger, giving a specific time and implied location for a promised surrender. Officers staked out the indicated location at the appointed hour. Nobody appeared. Later that same day, a third note arrived, again built from cut-out letters stating simply, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." A handful of further taunting letters followed over the following weeks, addressed to police and press alike, before stopping as abruptly as they'd begun. And despite extensive analysis of the handwriting, paper stock, and cut-out lettering technique at the time, investigators were never able to conclusively determine whether the letters had genuinely come from Short's killer, or from an opportunistic hoaxer capitalizing on a case that had, by this point, become the single biggest story in the city. A genuine ambiguity that has never been resolved, and that later researchers still actively disagree about. Over the decades since, a number of specific suspects have been proposed, publicly named, and in some cases extensively investigated by later researchers, journalists and retired detectives working the case as effectively a lifelong obsession, though it's important to be clear that none of these theories has ever produced the kind of definitive physical evidence that would allow for a formal posthumous resolution of the case. The most widely discussed suspect in recent decades is Dr. George Hodel, a Los Angeles physician with a documented history of disturbing personal conduct, including a 1949 arrest for the alleged rape of his own 14-year-old daughter, a case in which he was tried and ultimately acquitted. Hodel's own son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, spent years after his father's death in 1999 investigating him as a potential suspect. Eventually publishing a book laying out circumstantial evidence he argued pointed to his father's guilt, including alleged connections between Hodel and Short through mutual acquaintances, surveillance transcripts from an unrelated 1949 wiretap investigation into Hodel that Steve Hodel has argued contain incriminating statements, and stylistic similarities Steve Hodel has drawn between the Black Dahlia crime scene and a series of other unsolved murders from the same era he's controversially attributed to his father as well. It's a genuinely compelling body of circumstantial argument that has convinced a meaningful number of researchers and journalists over the years, though other researchers and several retired LAPD detectives who worked or later reviewed the case have pushed back on specific elements of Steve Hodale's evidence, arguing much of it remains interpretive and circumstantial rather than conclusive. And the LAPD itself has never reopened the case or formally named George Hodel as its official suspect, despite acknowledging he was among the individuals investigated at the time. Other names have surfaced repeatedly across decades of amateur and professional investigation into the case as well. Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner in whose Los Angeles home Short had stayed for a period before her death, and who was known to socialize with her, was investigated at the time and has remained a recurring name in later theories, partly because of his direct personal connection to Short in the weeks before her murder, though no physical evidence has ever tied him definitively to the crime. Leslie Dillon, a former mortician's assistant with a documented interest in the case who corresponded extensively and suspiciously with a psychiatrist consulting for the LAPD at the time, demonstrating what investigators felt was troubling, specific knowledge of details about the murder that hadn't been publicly released, was detained and interrogated at length in 1949, though he was ultimately released without charge after investigators concluded the evidence against him remained circumstantial. A comparatively newer theory raised publicly by a former LAPD detective's son in more recent years has pointed to a different named individual entirely, a private detective whose son claims to have found suggestive photographs and possessions among his father's belongings after his death, a theory that has generated fresh media coverage without producing anything close to definitive proof either. What all of these competing theories share, whatever their individual merits, is the same fundamental limitation: without physical forensic evidence that modern DNA testing could conclusively link to a living or documented suspect, and without the case ever having been formally reopened by the LAPD. With contemporary investigative resources applied to it, the Black Dahlia murder exists in a permanent evidentiary limbo, a case with no shortage of suspects, arguments, and circumstantial theories, and no realistic path remaining toward the kind of definitive legal resolution that would satisfy a courtroom. Elizabeth Short's actual case file, along with substantial evidence originally collected by the LAPD, has reportedly been lost, destroyed, or degraded over the intervening decades in ways that have made any renewed forensic examination of the original physical evidence essentially impossible. A detail that itself has fueled decades of additional speculation, ranging from ordinary institutional negligence and poor records retention practices typical of mid-century police departments, to more conspiratorial theories about deliberate distraction of evidence tied to a suspect with connections powerful enough to interfere with the investigation at the time, though no credible documented evidence has ever substantiated that more extreme version of events. It's also worth being honest about how badly the press coverage of the era treated Elizabeth Short as a person, because that pattern shaped public perception of the case for decades afterward and, in a real sense, is still being corrected by more careful modern reporting today. Competing Los Angeles newspapers, racing each other for exclusive angles on the single biggest crime story the city had seen in years, quickly settled on a sensationalized, largely fabricated portrait of Short as a manipulative, promiscuous drifter who moved from man to man across Hollywood, a narrative that fit neatly into 1940s tabloid conventions about young women who came to Los Angeles chasing fame, and one that had the convenient effect of implicitly suggesting Short herself bore some responsibility for what happened to her. Investigators and later researchers who've gone back through the actual case file, interviewed transcripts and contemporaries' first-hand accounts have found comparatively little solid evidence supporting the more lurid claims that dominated 1947 headlines, and considerably more evidence of a young woman with a difficult, unstable upbringing, ongoing health problems, and an uncertain, transient life typical of countless other young women who arrived in post-war Los Angeles with vague hopes and no real financial safety net, rather than the calculating, hypersexualized caricature the newspapers constructed and that persisted in popular retellings of the case for generations afterward. Nearly 80 years on, the Black Dahlia murder remains one of the most enduring true crime cases in American history, having generated multiple books, films, an acclaimed James Ellroy novel and subsequent movie adaptation loosely inspired by the case, and a permanent, ongoing presence in true crime media that shows no sign of fading. The staying power reflects a combination of factors that rarely align this precisely in any single case: a genuinely shocking, deliberately theatrical crime scene that guaranteed massive contemporary media coverage, a victim whose invented nickname and dramatic Hollywood-adjacent backstory made for an irresistible tabloid narrative, even though much of that narrative, including her supposed acting ambitions, was considerably exaggerated by the press at the time relative to the more ordinary, difficult reality of her actual life. A total absence of forensic technology capable of definitively closing the case using methods available today, and a genuine, documented pattern of institutional failures, interagency friction, lost evidence, and an overwhelmed investigation that collectively ensured no single suspect was ever definitively confirmed. Elizabeth Short herself, a 22-year-old woman with a difficult childhood and an uncertain, transient life in post-war Los Angeles, has in some ways been almost entirely obscured by the mythology that grew up around her death, reduced across decades of retelling to a nickname and a crime scene, rather than remembered as a specific, real person whose actual life and whose actual killer both remain to this day only partially understood. The case's influence on American crime fiction and film has been substantial enough that it's worth acknowledging directly, since so much of the public's mental image of the Black Dahlia now comes filtered through fiction rather than the actual documented case file. Author James Ellroy's 1987 novel The Black Dahlia, part of his broader fictionalized L.A. Court A series exploring corruption and violence in mid-century Los Angeles, used the real unsolved murder as a springboard for an entirely invented detective narrative and a fictional resolution to the case, later adapted into a 2006 feature film directed by Brian De Palma. Ellroy has been open in interviews about his personal connection to the case, drawing a direct line between his fascination with Short's unsolved murder and the unrelated, similarly unsolved murder of his own mother when he was a child, a connection that adds a genuinely personal dimension to why the Black Dahlia case specifically, among countless other unsolved mid-century murders, became such an enduring cultural touchstone. Countless other books, documentaries, podcast series, and true crime video essays have followed in the decades since, each one working from the same limited pool of surviving case documentation, contemporary newspaper archives, and the competing theories advanced by researchers like Steve Hodel, meaning that much of what circulates online today as the story of the Black Dahlia is, in reality, a blend of the genuinely documented 1947 case file with layers of later speculation, dramatization, and outright fictional invention that have accumulated on top of it over nearly 8 decades, often without a clear line drawn between the two for casual readers encountering the case for the first time. The Los Angeles Police Department has never formally closed the Elizabeth Short case, technically keeping it open as an active cold case, even though, by the department's own acknowledgement, the combination of degraded or lost physical evidence, the deaths of virtually every original witness and every seriously considered suspect, and the total absence of any surviving biological evidence suitable for modern DNA analysis make an actual prosecutable resolution at this point exceedingly unlikely. Elizabeth Short was buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, her funeral attended by her mother and sisters in a service that, compared to the sensational citywide media circus surrounding her murder investigation, was notably small and private, a final, quiet contrast to everything that had happened to her name and her story in the weeks before it. Nearly 80 years later, that gap between the deeply private, difficult, and largely unremarkable real-life Elizabeth Short actually lived, and the sprawling, sensationalized public mythology that grew up around the brutal way it ended, remains, in its own right, one of the most quietly unsettling parts of the entire case. Modern forensic advances have periodically renewed hope that the case might still be solvable, even 80 years on, though those hopes have consistently run into the same fundamental obstacle: the near-total loss or degradation of the original physical evidence. Genetic genealogy, the same investigative technique that cracked the decades-old Golden State Killer case and numerous other cold cases in recent years by matching crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases, has occasionally been floated by journalists and true crime researchers as a potential path to resolving the Black Dahlia murder. But law enforcement officials who've addressed the possibility publicly have been candid that, without any surviving, properly preserved biological evidence from the original 1947 crime scene, there's simply no genetic sample left to run through those databases in the first place, a limitation that effectively closes off the single most successful cold case technique of the last decade before it can even begin. Some individual researchers, including Steve Hodel, have pursued privately funded efforts to test specific pieces of evidence they've personally obtained or gained access to over the years, though none of these independent efforts has produced results accepted by the LAPD as sufficient to reopen or formally resolve the case. Barring some currently unknown cache of preserved evidence surfacing from an old case file or private collection somewhere, the honest, current scientific consensus among researchers who studied the case most closely is that the Black Dahlia murder has likely passed the point where modern forensic technology can meaningfully change its status, leaving the historical and circumstantial arguments already advanced by researchers like Steve Hodel as close to a final answer as the case is ever likely to get. In the early hours of November 13, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were shot to death in their sleep, in their own beds, inside a Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York. Less than 2 years later, a different family moved into that same house, stayed exactly 28 days, and fled, claiming the home was possessed by something that had terrorized them nightly. Their story became one of the best-selling horror books of all time, and one of the most profitable horror franchises in film history. But underneath the legend of the Amityville Horror sits a real murder case with a convicted killer, and a separate, far more disputed haunting story that has been investigated, picked apart, and largely discredited by journalists and researchers for nearly 50 years. Here's what's actually documented fact, and what almost certainly isn't. Start with what's not in dispute, because the DeFeo murders themselves are about as thoroughly documented as any American homicide case from the era. Ronald DeFeo Jr., 23 years old at the time, lived at 112 Ocean Avenue with his parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeo, and his 4 younger siblings, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew, ranging in age from 9 to 18. Just after 3 in the morning on November 13, 1974, using a Marlin .35 caliber lever-action rifle, DeFeo shot all 6 family members while they slept, moving methodically from room to room. Each victim was found lying face down in bed, and investigators noted that none of the other family members appeared to have woken during the shootings, despite the close proximity of the bedrooms and the volume a rifle discharge would produce indoors, a detail that struck investigators as strange, enough at the time to factor into their read of what had actually happened that night. Later that same evening, Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked into a local bar, Henry's, visibly distressed, telling patrons that his parents had been shot and urging people to come back to the house with him. When police arrived, DeFeo initially told them he believed the killings were the work of a local organized crime associate named Louis Fellini, claiming his father had mafia ties that made him a target. Investigators quickly found holes in that account, and under continued questioning, DeFeo confessed within about a day to having killed his entire family himself. At trial, his defense attorney pursued an insanity defense, and DeFeo himself offered shifting, often bizarre explanations for his actions over the following months and years, at various points claiming he heard voices from within the house commanding him to kill, and at other points describing more mundane motives rooted in ongoing conflict with his father, financial disputes, and a documented history of drug use and volatile behavior in the family home in the period leading up to the murders. The jury rejected the insanity defense, In November 1975, DeFeo was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life on each count, to be served concurrently. He remained incarcerated until his death in March 2021, and in decades of parole hearings and interviews conducted from prison, he offered still more varying, sometimes contradictory accounts of his motives and of what, if anything, actually happened inside that house beyond his own documented actions, none of which investigators, journalists, or later researchers ever found fully consistent or fully credible on their own. It's worth understanding the DeFeo household itself a little more, because the picture that emerged during the trial and in decades of subsequent interviews with surviving relatives and neighbors paints a genuinely troubled family environment well before the murders occurred. Context that matters. For understanding the case honestly rather than treating it purely as an inexplicable, out-of-nowhere eruption of violence, Ronald DeFeo Sr. was, by numerous accounts given at trial and afterward, a demanding, at times physically abusive father, and the household was reportedly marked by ongoing tension over money, Ronald Jr.'s escalating drug use, and his father's frustration with his son's behavior and lack of direction, despite Ronald Jr. working for the family's Buick dealership. Ronald Jr. himself had a documented history of petty theft, forged checks and drug use in the period leading up to the murders, and prosecutors argued at trial that the killings were substantially motivated by ordinary, if extreme, personal and financial grievances rather than anything supernatural, a theory that lines up with the jury's ultimate rejection of the insanity defense his attorney presented. That mundane human explanation, a troubled, drug-using young man with a volatile relationship with his father, snapping violently after years of accumulated conflict, has always sat somewhat awkwardly next to the far more dramatic voices from the house narrative DeFeo himself sometimes offered, and which later became a central pillar of the haunting mythology that grew up around the house after his conviction. That's the murder case, fully investigated, tried and resolved in a court of law within about a year of the killings, with a named convicted perpetrator who spent the rest of his life in prison. The haunting story is a completely separate matter, and this is where the actual documented record gets considerably murkier and considerably more contested. In December 1975, roughly 13 months after the murders, George and Kathy Lutz purchased 17 UF, reportedly at a significantly reduced price, given the property's grim recent history, and moved in with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. According to the account the Lutz family gave publicly, almost immediately after moving in they began experiencing escalating paranormal phenomena, unexplained cold spots throughout the house, foul odors appearing and disappearing without source, doors and windows damaging themselves or opening on their own, swarms of flies appearing in a room during winter, a room the family said became disturbingly cold no matter the setting on the house's furnace, green slime allegedly oozing from walls and ceilings, and, most dramatically, George Lutz's own claims of waking repeatedly at exactly 3:15 in the morning, a detail he tied to the approximate time investigators believed the DeFeo murders had occurred the previous year. The family said the haunting escalated to the point where they fled the house after just 28 days in January 1976, leaving behind most of their possessions and never returning to live there again. The Lutz family's account became public in dramatic fashion once author Jay Anson was brought on to turn their story into a book, published in September 1977 as The Amityville Horror, a True Story. The book was a massive commercial success, spending weeks on bestseller lists and eventually selling in the range of 10 million copies, and it was adapted into a hit feature film in 1979 starring James Brolin and Margot Kidder, which itself spawned a sprawling franchise of sequels, prequels, remakes, and spin-offs that has continued generating new installments for decades since, built on a story. Its own central details have never been independently verified, and have in several specific respects been directly, credibly disputed. The most significant challenge to the Lutz account came from an entirely unexpected source. Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s own defense attorney, William Weber, who represented DeFeo at his 1975 murder trial. In interviews given in the years following the book and film's release, Weber stated publicly and repeatedly that he had met with George and Kathy Lutz not long after they fled the house, and that the haunting narrative that eventually became the Amityville Horror was substantially developed, collaboratively between himself and the Lutzes, over what he specifically described as many bottles of wine, as a way to generate a compelling story that could simultaneously support a stronger appeal for DeFeo, potentially bolstering claims that violent, external supernatural forces had influenced his actions, while also creating a commercially viable book and media property the parties involved stood to profit from. Weber's account has never been fully retracted, and it lines up closely with the documented pattern independent researchers have identified when examining the Lutz family's specific claims against the verifiable historical and physical record of the house. Several of the most dramatic details, including certain weather conditions, police visits, and structural damage the book describes, don't match contemporaneous police reports, weather records, or accounts given by other people who visited the house during the relevant 28-day window, including a Catholic priest whose own account of supposedly blessing the house and experiencing paranormal warnings shifted meaningfully between different retellings he gave over subsequent years. The Lutz family itself never fully backed away from their story, even as skepticism mounted. George Lutz, who died in 2006, maintained until his death that the events described in the book were, in his words, mostly true, while acknowledging in later interviews that some details had been altered or dramatized for the book and film. Kathy Lutz similarly continued defending the substance of their experience in the house in interviews given over subsequent decades. In June 1979, the couple underwent polygraph examinations administered by two well-regarded polygraph specialists, results the family and their supporters have pointed to as evidence supporting their credibility, though polygraph results of this kind have never been considered rigorous, independently verifiable scientific evidence by mainstream forensic science, and are generally inadmissible in American courts for exactly that reason. Notably, the broader Lutz and DeFeo families themselves have never presented a unified, consistent account of what did or didn't happen at 112 Ocean Avenue. Various individual family members and relatives connected to the case have, at different points over the decades since, given interviews contradicting specific details offered by other family members, while multiple parties connected to the story, including several people only tangentially involved, have pursued their own separate books, documentaries, and media deals built around competing versions of events. A pattern that, taken as a whole, looks considerably more consistent with a story that grew and mutated for commercial reasons over time than with a single, stable, consistently reported paranormal experience. The haunting story also picked up a considerably higher profile boost in March 1976, when self-described paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, already becoming well known in the mid-1970s for their involvement in other reportedly haunted locations, were invited by the Lutzes to conduct a formal investigation of the house, operating under their own organization, the New England Society for Psychic Research. The Warrens brought in a television crew and a group of additional researchers, spending a night in the house running cameras continuously and conducting a séance in the home's basement. The visit produced one genuinely famous piece of media, a photograph taken with an automatic infrared camera that appears to show a ghostly, glowing-eyed young boy peering from a doorway, an image that has circulated widely in Amityville-related documentaries and books ever since as ostensible physical evidence of something otherworldly in the house. It has also been extensively disputed. Journalists and other individuals present for the Warrens' investigation that night, including a television reporter who covered the event live, later described the actual atmosphere in the house as largely uneventful, with one journalist Riley recalling that the most notable event of the entire overnight investigation was the crew debating when they'd get to eat the sandwiches they'd brought along. Skeptics and later researchers, including authors who specifically investigated and wrote a book characterizing the entire Amityville case as a hoax, have pointed to the Warrens' broader body of work and their consistent commercial involvement in books, lecture tours, and eventually a hit film. Franchise of their own built around cases like this one as reason for real skepticism about both the photograph's authenticity and the Warrens' investigative rigor more broadly. Criticism that has followed the couple's legacy well beyond the Amityville case specifically and into essentially every other case they became associated with over their subsequent careers. Subsequent owners of 112 Ocean Avenue have added their own layer of context to the case, and it's a genuinely significant one. The family that purchased the house directly after the Lutzes moved out lived there for more than a decade, extensively documented by journalists at the time specifically because of the house's notoriety, and repeatedly and publicly stated they experienced absolutely nothing unusual during their entire residency. No cold spots, no unexplained phenomena, nothing resembling any of the dramatic events described in Anson's book. That family later filed and won a lawsuit against several parties connected to the Amityville horror franchise over the intrusive, unwanted attention and property damage caused by the ongoing public fascination with the house, including trespassers and paparazzi drawn by the story's fame rather than by anything they themselves ever reported experiencing while living there. Even the house's street address and physical facade have since been altered by later owners, specifically to discourage the steady stream of tourists, ghost hunters, and true crime enthusiasts, who continued showing up looking for the infamous quarter-moon-shaped windows featured prominently in the film adaptation, a detail that, more than anything else, underscores how the pop culture version of Amityville long ago detached itself from anything resembling a verifiable, ongoing paranormal reality of the actual physical property. Fact-checking organizations, journalists, and researchers who revisited the case repeatedly over the decades, including detailed investigations published by outlets like Snopes, specifically examining the book's central claims against the documented historical record, have consistently reached the same broad conclusion. The underlying murders were unquestionably real, tragic, and thoroughly documented through a completed criminal trial and conviction, while the subsequent haunting narrative that made the house internationally famous shows extensive, credible evidence of having been substantially fabricated or heavily embellished for commercial purposes, developed in close collaboration with a defense attorney who has openly admitted his own role in shaping it, and never independently corroborated by any owner of the property before or since. That doesn't necessarily mean every single person connected to the Lutz family's account was being deliberately cynically dishonest from the very beginning. It's entirely possible, and has been suggested by some researchers examining the case, that a family who had just purchased a house with a horrific, very recent multiple murder history genuinely experienced heightened anxiety, disrupted sleep, and an atmosphere of genuine dread inside that specific house, entirely explainable through ordinary psychological stress responses to living somewhere 6 people had recently been murdered, and that those very real, very human reactions were then substantially amplified, reshaped, and commercialized into the considerably more dramatic supernatural narrative that eventually became a best-selling book and a multi-decade film franchise. It's worth pausing on just how large the commercial machine built on top of this 128-day stay eventually became, because the scale genuinely helps explain why the story has proven so durable and so resistant to fact-checking across nearly 50 years. Beyond Jay Anson's original 1977 book and the 1979 film, the Amityville franchise has expanded into dozens of sequels, prequels, spin-offs, and loosely connected films bearing the Amityville name, ranging from official continuations to low-budget, tenuously related horror movies that simply license the brand recognition of the title, along with a 2005 remake, additional books exploring supposedly related cases, and a steady stream of television specials and documentary revisits every few years, timed to round-number anniversaries of the murders. Very few horror franchises in American film history have managed to sustain commercial output for this long from a single, geographically specific true story. And that longevity has its own self-reinforcing effect. Each new film, book, or documentary introduces the story to another generation of Viewers who often encounter the dramatized, embellished version first, long before, if ever, encountering the more sober journalistic accounts and fact-checks that have quietly picked apart the Lutz family's specific claims in the decades since. George Lutz himself was reportedly displeased with several of the later films and spin-offs, at points pursuing his own legal action against producers he felt had misrepresented his family's story even further beyond what he considered the mostly true original account. A genuinely strange irony, given how much of that original account has itself been credibly disputed by outside researchers, journalists, and DeFeo's own former defense attorney. What makes the Amityville story genuinely worth understanding carefully, rather than dismissing entirely or accepting uncritically, is precisely that split. A horrific, fully real, fully prosecuted mass murder happened inside that house in November 1974, and Ronald DeFeo Jr. spent the rest of his life in prison for it, dying there in 2021, having never given a fully consistent account of his own motives. Everything that came after, the flies, the green slime, the 3:15 wake-ups, the haunted red room in the basement, is a separate story entirely, one built by specific, named, identifiable people, with a documented financial incentive to make it as dramatic and marketable as possible, and one that has never been corroborated by a single other person who has lived in that house in the nearly 50 years since the Lutz family left it after 28 days. Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s own life after conviction adds one final, genuinely unsettling layer to the story, precisely because of how unresolved it remained right up until his death. Across more than 4.5 decades in prison, DeFeo gave numerous interviews to journalists, documentary filmmakers, and true crime authors, and almost never told the same story twice. At various points, he claimed his sister Dawn had actually committed some of the murders before he killed her too, a version of events investigators at the time and since have found no supporting physical evidence for. At other points, he reverted to blaming outside intruders, or described hearing voices, or offered more mundane accounts centering on drug-fueled rage and long-simmering resentment toward his father, sometimes contradicting an account he'd given in a previous interview just years, or even months, earlier. He was denied parole repeatedly over the decades, in part because parole boards specifically cited his continued refusal to give a consistent, credible account of his own crime and his own motives, a genuinely unusual detail in the annals of American parole hearings, where boards are typically evaluating remorse and rehabilitation rather than working through irreconcilable competing confessions from the same person. DeFeo died in prison in March 2021 at age 69, having spent the last 46 years of his life incarcerated, and having never, in all that time, given investigators, journalists, or his own remaining family members a single, stable, verifiable account of exactly what happened inside that house in the early hours of November 13, 1974, or why. In that specific sense, even setting the entire disputed haunting narrative aside completely, the true story of Amityville still ends without a fully satisfying resolution. Just a considerably more mundane and considerably more human, unresolved question than the one the books and films eventually built an entire franchise around. It's worth noting too that the Warrens' involvement in Amityville turned out to be far from a one-off appearance in the couple's careers, and understanding what came after helps put their specific claims about the house in proper context. Ed and Lorraine Warren went on to build an entire decade-long career, and eventually a hugely successful modern film franchise built loosely around their case files, centered on the same basic pattern established at Amityville: a family reporting frightening experiences, the Warrens arriving to conduct an investigation, and a resulting book, media appearance, or eventually feature film treating their conclusions as established, well-documented fact. Several of the Warrens' other well-known cases, including the Perron family haunting later dramatized in a major studio horror franchise, have faced very similar scrutiny and skepticism from journalists and researchers to what's been directed at their Amityville investigation specifically, with Family members involved in some of those later cases likewise offering accounts that shifted or expanded considerably over time, and with independent witnesses in several instances reporting a far less dramatic reality than what eventually reached theatres. None of that retroactively proves the Warrens acted in deliberate bad faith at Amityville specifically, and the couple maintained until their respective deaths that their investigative work, however unconventional by modern scientific standards, reflected a genuine, sincerely held belief in what they documented. But their broader career pattern of arriving at troubled properties and consistently finding dramatic, camera-ready confirmation of exactly the kind of activity that supports a compelling book or film deal is itself a data point serious researchers weigh heavily when assessing how much independent evidentiary weight their specific Amityville findings actually deserve. The murders made 112 Ocean Avenue infamous. Everything that made it a horror movie franchise came afterward, and, according to nearly every serious journalist and researcher who's actually dug into the paper trail, came from considerably more human, considerably more commercial motives than anything living in the walls. In February 2013, guests at a downtown Los Angeles hotel started complaining that the water tasted strange and the pressure had dropped to almost nothing. Maintenance staff climbed onto the roof to check the hotel's 4 large water storage tanks and found the source of the problem inside one of them, the body of a 21-year-old Canadian tourist named Elisa Lam, who had been missing for 19 days. Weeks earlier, police had released elevator surveillance footage of Lam behaving in a way so strange, so genuinely difficult to explain, that it turned an already troubling missing persons case into one of the most viral, most heavily theorized true crime mysteries the internet has ever produced. The official cause of death has actually been established for years. The internet's fascination with the case, and the real harm that fascination caused to at least one completely innocent person, hasn't gone anywhere. Here's the real story of Elisa Lam and the Cecil Hotel. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old student from Vancouver, British Columbia, traveling alone on the west coast of the United States in January 2013, staying in Los Angeles at the Cecil Hotel, a large, aging downtown building that had, by that point, spent decades as an affordable option for budget travelers, largely because of its rock-bottom rates relative to its location, and largely despite a genuinely dark reputation the building had already accumulated long before Lam ever checked in. Lam had been in regular contact with her family throughout her trip and had been documenting her travels on a personal blog, giving investigators and, eventually, the public an unusually detailed record of her state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance. She was last confirmed seen alive on January 31, 2013. When her family lost contact with her and reported her missing, Los Angeles police began a search that initially focused on the hotel and the surrounding downtown area, canvassing the building and reviewing available surveillance footage from the property. Lam's own writing from her trip has become an important, if often uncomfortably scrutinized, part of the documented record surrounding her final days. She maintained an active blog on Tumblr throughout her travels, posting regularly about her experiences, her reactions to the cities she was visiting, and, in entries dating from her final stretch in Los Angeles, increasingly fragmented, anxious, and unusual writing that her family and mental health. Professionals who later reviewed the case would point to as consistent with a deteriorating psychiatric state. Journalists and amateur researchers alike combed through those posts extensively once the case went viral, and it's worth being honest that this scrutiny sits in a genuinely uncomfortable place ethically, poring over the final, clearly distressed writing of a young woman experiencing a mental health crisis, treating it as detective work rather than what it actually was, a real, documented record of someone's private psychological decline in the days before her death. Her family, in the limited public statements they've made over the years since, has specifically asked that her mental health history be treated with basic dignity rather than as raw material for online speculation. A request that, by most honest accounts of how this case has actually played out, across true crime media and internet forums in the years since, has not been especially well honoured. On February 14, 2013, Roughly 2 weeks into the investigation, the LAPD released a portion of that surveillance footage to the public, hoping the wider exposure might generate leads. The clip, recorded by a security camera inside one of the Cecil Hotel's elevators, shows Lam entering the elevator alone, then behaving in a manner that struck nearly everyone who watched it as deeply unsettling. She presses multiple floor buttons in rapid succession. She steps out of the elevator repeatedly, peers down the hallway in both directions as though checking for someone, and steps back in. She makes a series of unusual hand gestures, at some points appearing to talk or gesture towards someone outside the frame of the camera. In a hallway the footage shows as otherwise completely empty. At one point she appears to hide, pressed into the corner of the elevator car, as if trying to avoid being seen. The doors of the elevator, visible for the first portion of the footage, never fully closed during the segment police released, despite Lam having pressed the buttons that should have triggered them to do so. The footage runs for a little under 3 minutes, and it went viral within days of its release, generating millions of views and an enormous rapid wave of amateur theorizing across social media, forums and video platforms, precisely because the behavior on screen looks, to an untrained eye, so specifically frightening and so hard to immediately explain. 5 days after the footage was released, on February 19, 2013, hotel maintenance staff responding to ongoing guest complaints about weak water pressure and an unpleasant taste and odor in the tap water climbed up to inspect the hotel's rooftop water tanks, large cylindrical storage tanks that supplied water throughout the building. Inside one of the 4 tanks they found Lam's body. She had been missing for 19 days at that point, and investigators determined she had likely been inside the tank for a significant portion of that time, meaning that for roughly 2.5 weeks, guests throughout the hotel had been showering, brushing their teeth, and drinking water that had been in direct contact with her remains, a detail that, once it became public, added an entirely new, visceral layer of horror to a case that was already generating enormous public attention. Before the water tanks were ever checked, investigators spent nearly 3 weeks working the case as a fairly conventional, if increasingly urgent, missing persons investigation, and the specific detective work that eventually connected the guest complaints about water quality to Lam's disappearance is itself a genuinely important part of the record, since it directly rebuts some of the more elaborate conspiracy theories suggesting the hotel or police had somehow deliberately delayed or covered up her discovery. Officers had already thoroughly searched the hotel's public areas, interviewed staff and guests, and reviewed available security footage in the days immediately following the missing persons report, without turning up anything beyond the elevator footage itself, which, notably, investigators had already reviewed internally well before its public release, releasing it specifically as a last resort once conventional leads had been exhausted, hoping the public's help might surface information the department's own resources hadn't. The rooftop water tanks weren't part of that initial search specifically because they were located behind a locked mechanical access area not included on standard guest-accessible floor plans. And it was only the unrelated, mundane complaint pattern about discolored, bad-tasting water arriving from multiple different rooms over several days that led maintenance staff, not detectives, to check the tanks directly, at which point the case shifted immediately from a missing persons investigation to a death investigation. That sequence of events, ordinary hotel maintenance stumbling onto the discovery rather than a specific investigative breakthrough, is part of why the case has retained such a strong "nobody was actually looking in the right place" quality that continues to feed public fascination with it well over a decade later. The subsequent investigation, including a full autopsy and toxicology screening, took several months to complete, and the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office ultimately ruled Lam's death an accident caused by drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing condition. The autopsy found no evidence of trauma consistent with an assault, no evidence of sexual assault, and toxicology results were consistent with Lam having stopped taking her prescribed psychiatric medication, a detail corroborated by both her own blog entries from the final days of her trip and, information her family provided to investigators about her diagnosis and treatment history. Investigators determined that the water tanks on the hotel roof were accessed through a hatch on top of each tank, secured with a lid, located on a section of roof that was technically off-limits to guests, but was, according to the hotel's own later statements and an internal security review, conducted after the case became public, both accessible without much difficulty and not covered by any alarm system at the time, a genuine security gap the hotel would later face scrutiny over. Given the height and awkward angle involved in climbing into a water tank of that kind, and given the absence of any evidence pointing to a struggle, LAPD investigators and the coroner's office concluded that Lam had climbed into the tank herself during an episode of acute psychiatric distress and that her death, however genuinely tragic, was not the result of foul play. It's worth being direct and careful about what that official finding actually means, because a huge amount of the internet mythology that grew up around this case has, in retrospect, treated Lam's mental health history less as a documented medical fact relevant to understanding what happened to her, and more as a plot device to be picked apart, dismissed, or treated with suspicion by amateur online investigators looking for a more dramatic explanation. Bipolar disorder, particularly during an untreated manic or mixed episode, can produce genuine, severe disorientation, paranoid ideation, unusual and erratic behavior, and impaired judgment about personal safety, symptoms that mental health professionals who later reviewed the publicly released elevator footage, including several psychiatrists who spoke to journalists covering the case, noted, appeared broadly consistent with a person experiencing an acute psychiatric crisis rather than evidence of a specifically choreographed or supernatural interaction with anyone else. Lam's own blog entries from her final days documented a real, escalating pattern of unusual thinking and heightened anxiety in the immediate lead-up to her death, evidence her family and investigators both treated as directly relevant medical context, not as some unrelated detail to be treated skeptically or explained away. None of that stopped the internet from spending years constructing an enormous, sprawling alternate mythology around the case anyway, and the scale of that mythology and the real damage it caused is very much part of the actual documented story here too. Amateur online investigators combing through the elevator footage for hidden clues produced theories ranging from the mundane, that Lam was simply playing an elevator game some claimed was popular among certain online communities at the time, to the considerably more elaborate that her death was connected to a supposed government experiment, a secret illness outbreak the hotel was allegedly covering up, or a deliberate murder staged to look accidental by hotel staff or a fellow guest. Theories that gained traction less because of any actual supporting evidence, and more because the genuinely strange elevator footage created a powerful, almost irresistible narrative vacuum that a formal, comparatively unglamorous psychiatric explanation struggled to fully satisfy for a global audience captivated by the footage first and the facts second. That online amateur investigation took an especially damaging turn when a specific individual, a Mexican extreme metal musician, performing under the stage name Morbid, whose real name is Pablo Vergara, became the target of an enormous, sustained harassment campaign after online sleuths misidentified him as a suspect based on almost nothing more than surface-level pattern matching between his music and the case. Vergara had released a music video roughly a year before Lam's death depicting violent imagery, and had written lyrics in an unrelated song that happened to reference dumping a body in water and mentioned the word China and internet forums, working from those two coincidental details alone. Without any evidence connecting him to Lam, the Cecil Hotel, or Los Angeles at all, spread the claim that he had stayed at the hotel at the same time as Lam and was somehow connected to her death. The false accusation spread rapidly enough that it was picked up and repeated by news outlets in Taiwan, giving the claim an entirely undeserved veneer of legitimacy. Vergara, who has stated publicly he had never even heard of Elisa Lam before being contacted about the accusations, had his YouTube, Facebook and Google accounts mass reported and terminated by online vigilantes received a visit from Mexican federal investigators specifically asking about the accusations, and has described the sustained harassment campaign as having a severe, lasting impact on his mental health, including a period of hospitalization. The lead LAPD homicide detective who worked the actual case has since confirmed publicly, on the record, that Vergara was never a suspect at any point in the investigation. It's a genuinely stark example of how quickly online amateur detective culture can manufacture an entirely fictional villain out of coincidence and pattern matching, and inflict real serious harm on a real innocent person in the process, a cautionary thread running underneath the entire case. That's at least as important as the mystery itself. The Cecil Hotel's own history did plenty of work fueling the case's mythology too. And unlike some of the more elaborate internet theories, this part is genuinely, thoroughly documented. Built in 1924 as an upscale destination hotel for business travelers, the Cecil's fortunes declined sharply within just a few years. As the Great Depression and the surrounding neighborhood's gradual transformation into what's now known as Skid Row left the hotel operating for decades primarily as low-cost, transient housing. That long stretch as an affordable, high-turnover residential hotel is directly connected to a genuinely disturbing list of deaths associated with the property over the ensuing decades, including numerous suicides, several of which reportedly involved guests jumping from upper-floor windows, at least one connected directly to the elevator shaft area, and a documented history of housing at least 2 convicted serial killers during their active crime sprees. Richard Ramirez, the serial killer known as the Night Stalker, stayed at the Cecil for a stretch during his 1984 and 1985 killing spree across Southern California, paying a nightly rate of around $14, reportedly returning to the hotel late at night, on more than one occasion, still in blood-stained clothing, without staff or fellow guests at the time apparently taking much notice. A detail that says as much about the hotel's transient, low-oversight clientele at the time as it does about Ramirez himself. Several years later, in 1991, Austrian journalist and convicted serial killer Jack Unterweger also stayed at the Cecil, while ostensibly researching a story on crime in Los Angeles, during which he murdered at least 3 sex workers in the surrounding area, reportedly having specifically chosen the Cecil because of its earlier association with Ramirez. By the time Elisa Lam checked in more than 2 decades later, the hotel's reputation as one of the darkest addresses in downtown Los Angeles was already well established among true crime enthusiasts and local historians alike, which is a significant part of why her death slotted so easily into an already existing narrative of the building as somehow cursed or haunted, rather than being received, as the coroner's investigation concluded, as a specific, isolated, and genuinely tragic instance of a young woman experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis while alone, far from home, in a large, poorly monitored building. The elevator footage itself has also been the subject of more sober, less sensational analysis in the years since, worth including because it complicates some of the more dramatic viral framing, without erasing how genuinely disturbing the footage remains. Building engineers and elevator maintenance specialists who've reviewed the footage professionally have pointed out that many of the elevator's specific behaviors in the video, doors that don't fully close, apparent malfunctions in response to Lam's repeated button presses, are consistent with a documented pattern of maintenance issues the Cecil Hotel's own aging elevator system reportedly had around that period, rather than requiring any external interference to explain. That doesn't fully account for Lam's own visible behavior in the footage. The gesturing, the apparent hiding, the repeated checking down an empty hallway, which mental health professionals maintain remains most consistent with a person in the midst of significant psychiatric distress. But it does remove one specific layer of mystery, the elevator's own seemingly erratic mechanical behavior, that a considerable amount of online theorizing treated as independently sinister rather than as a separate mundane maintenance issue that simply happened to coincide with an already deeply unsettling few minutes of footage. The Cecil Hotel itself faced a significant reckoning of its own in the aftermath. well beyond the immediate news cycle. The building's ownership, already navigating the fallout from decades of accumulated tragedy tied to the property, closed a portion of the hotel to the public not long after and began an extensive renovation and partial rebranding effort, eventually converting sections of the building into more tightly managed, security-conscious housing, in part a direct response to the specific security gaps, an accessible rooftop tank area with no functioning alarm system that Lam's death had exposed so publicly. The hotel's owners also faced renewed scrutiny from Los Angeles city officials over building code and security compliance in the months following the case, adding a genuine, if less dramatic, regulatory dimension to a story that most retellings focus on almost exclusively for its mystery and horror elements rather than its more mundane building safety implications. A 2021 documentary series produced for a major streaming platform revisited the case in considerable depth, nearly a decade after Lam's death, interviewing LAPD investigators, journalists, and former hotel guests. And while the series was broadly well reviewed for taking a more responsible, fact-based approach than much of the earlier internet-era coverage, including directly addressing the harm caused to Pablo Vergara, its release still triggered another significant wave of renewed public fascination, fresh theorizing, and, inevitably, a fresh round of amateur online sleuthing picking back through the same elevator footage that had already been analyzed to exhaustion for the better part of a decade by that point. Elisa Lam's family has, in the years since her death, spoken publicly only rarely, and when they have, they've consistently expressed frustration and genuine pain over how thoroughly the internet's fascination with the case transformed their daughter's death and her documented struggle with mental illness specifically into a form of mass entertainment largely detached from her as an actual person. A 2021 documentary series revisiting the case drew renewed massive public attention and a fresh wave of online speculation nearly a decade after her death, once again putting the Cecil Hotel and Lam's final days back in front of a global audience, and once again, according to reporting at the time, reopening old wounds for a family that had already spent years watching their daughter's death treated as an unsolved puzzle for strangers to pick apart, years after the actual investigating authorities had already reached, documented, and never revised their official conclusion. Elisa Lam's case remains, in the strictest factual sense, closed and resolved. A documented accidental drowning following an episode of acute psychiatric crisis in a hotel with a long, well-documented history of inadequate oversight of guests in genuine distress. What's never fully closed and shows no real sign of closing is the far larger, considerably messier story of what happens when millions of strangers online decide a grieving family's tragedy and a documented medical crisis isn't a satisfying enough answer, and go looking for a more dramatic one instead, sometimes with consequences, as Pablo Vergara's case makes painfully clear, that land on entirely innocent people who never had anything to do with the case at all. There's a broader pattern worth naming directly here, because Elisa Lam's case is far from the only one where it's shown up. A genuinely disturbing number of the internet's most viral, most heavily theorized unsolved mysteries of the last 15 years share a strikingly similar shape underneath the theorizing, a documented, officially concluded finding, often involving mental illness, substance use, or another sensitive personal circumstance that a global audience of amateur investigators has collectively decided is somehow too mundane, too sad, or too unsatisfying to be the real, complete answer, prompting years of continued digging for something more dramatic that the original investigators supposedly missed or covered up. It's an understandable impulse in the abstract. Genuine miscarriages of justice and real institutional cover-ups do happen, and healthy public skepticism toward official findings has, in a real minority of cases, actually helped uncover them. But the Elisa Lam case demonstrates just as clearly what that same impulse can produce when it's aimed at a case that was, by all the actual physical, toxicological, and behavioral evidence gathered by trained investigators, already correctly and thoroughly resolved, years of continued public, Suspicion cast on hotel staff and management, with no evidence connecting them to wrongdoing. A family forced to watch their daughter's genuine mental health crisis picked over indefinitely by strangers treating it as an unsolved puzzle rather than a documented medical tragedy. And in Pablo Vergara's case specifically, the near-total public destruction of a completely unconnected person's life and reputation, built on nothing more than a coincidental lyric and a viral rumor that outran the actual facts before anyone with real authority over the case had a chance to correct it. 5 cases, 5 very different kinds of horror, and one thing genuinely connecting all of them. In every single story here, the actual documented facts, the ones investigators, court records and journalists spent years establishing, turned out to be more than enough to make each case worth telling without needing a single invented detail. 9 hikers really did die on a mountain the Mansi people warned people to avoid, and it took 60 years of advancing science to even partially explain why. A family really was terrorized by an anonymous letter writer who was never caught. A 22-year-old woman really was murdered in Los Angeles in a way so brutal it stayed unsolved for nearly 80 years. 6 people really were shot dead in their own home by a member of their own family, whose real motives may never be fully known regardless of how many decades pass. And a young woman really did die alone in the middle of a documented mental health crisis, in a hotel with a body count stretching back a century, only to have millions of strangers spend years afterward deciding the truth wasn't dramatic enough. That's the real through line across every one of these 5 stories. The truth was never the boring part. It just took considerably more work to find than the myths that grew up around it.